August 15, 1973, Crystal Lake, Minnesota. 22-year-old Susan Hartley vanished during the town's annual summer carnival, leaving behind only a single white sneaker by the water's edge and a community that would spend 50 years wondering what really happened that humid Tuesday night when the Ferris wheel lights reflected off the dark water. The humid air hung thick over Crystal Lake on August 15, 1973, carrying the mingled scents of popcorn, cigarette smoke, and the algae-tinged water that reflected the carnival's neon lights like scattered jewels. Susan Hartley smoothed her yellow sundress and checked her Timex watch for the third time in 10 minutes, the thin second hand seeming to move slower than usual in the oppressive Minnesota heat. "Susie, you're making me dizzy with all that fidgeting," her younger sister Margaret laughed, threading her arm through Susan's as they walked past the ring toss booth. At 19, Margaret still carried the eager energy of someone who believed the world held endless possibilities, while Susan, 3 years older and fresh from her college graduation, seemed to carry invisible weights that pulled at her shoulders. Tommy Kowalski appeared beside them, his varsity jacket slung over his shoulder despite the temperature, dark hair slicked back in the style that made all the local girls swoon. He'd been dating Susan since her senior year of high school, and everyone in Crystal Lake expected them to announce their engagement before summer's end. "Ladies," he grinned, wrapping an arm around Susan's waist, "what do you say we win Margaret that stuffed elephant she's been eyeing?" The carnival sprawled across the town park like a temporary city of dreams, complete with a Ferris wheel that groaned reassuringly as it lifted couples toward the star-scattered sky. Families clustered around picnic tables sharing funnel cakes dusted with powdered sugar, while teenagers gathered near the tilt-a-whirl, their laughter mixing with the mechanical calliope music that had been the soundtrack of summer in Crystal Lake for as long as anyone could remember. Susan's attention kept drifting toward the lake itself, where the old wooden dock stretched into the darkness beyond the carnival lights. She touched her throat absently, fingers playing with the delicate gold chain her grandmother had given her, a nervous habit that Margaret had noticed becoming more frequent in recent weeks. "Earth to Susan," Tommy teased, following her gaze toward the water. "You planning on taking a midnight swim or something?" "Just thinking about how peaceful it looks," Susan replied, but her voice carried an odd tension that made Margaret study her sister's profile in the shifting carnival lights. There was something different about Susan lately, a secretiveness that reminded Margaret of when they were children, and Susan would hide diary entries under her mattress. The evening wore on with the comfortable rituals of small-town summer entertainment. They rode the carousel, its painted horses rising and falling to the wheeze of organ music, while parents waved from the sidelines. Margaret won a small teddy bear at the basketball toss, and Tommy spent $5 trying unsuccessfully to knock down milk bottles with baseballs that felt suspiciously light. Around 10 o'clock, as the crowd began to thin and some of the younger families started gathering sleepy children, Susan excused herself to visit the restroom trailer parked near the edge of the park. She kissed Tommy's cheek, promised Margaret she'd be right back, and disappeared into the maze of carnival booths and food trucks. That was the last time anyone saw Susan Hartley alive. When she hadn't returned after 20 minutes, Tommy and Margaret began searching, calling her name over the diminishing sounds of the carnival. The Ferris wheel operator helped them look through the crowd, and the cotton candy vendor remembered seeing Susan walking toward the lake around 10:15, but after that, nothing. By midnight, when the carnival workers were breaking down the smaller games, and the last teenagers were being called home by parents standing on front porches, Tommy called the police from the payphone outside Mel's diner. The next morning, as the August sun burned off the lake's early mist, a volunteer searcher found Susan's white ked sneaker floating near the dock, the laces still tied in the double knot she'd favored since childhood. Detective Ray Morrison had been working for the Crystal Lake Police Department for 15 years when Susan Hartley disappeared, long enough to know that most missing persons cases in their quiet town involved teenagers running away to Minneapolis or domestic disputes that resolved themselves within 24 hours. But something about finding that single sneaker by the water made his stomach tight with the kind of dread that came from experience. The investigation began at dawn on August 16th, with Morrison coordinating search teams while the carnival workers packed their equipment around them. The contrast felt surreal, deflating bounce houses and dismantling game booths, while divers searched the lake's murky depths for any sign of the young woman who had vanished just hours before. Morrison set up his makeshift command center at a picnic table, spreading out hand-drawn maps of the lake and surrounding area, while using his department's single two-way radio to coordinate with the volunteer search teams. The technology felt primitive even then, with static crackling through every transmission and frequent dead zones that left searchers temporarily cut off from communication. "Ray, we've got something," came the voice of Bob Hensley, one of the local volunteer firefighters, his words nearly lost in the radio's static. Morrison pressed the device closer to his ear, trying to filter out the background noise of boat engines and shouting volunteers. But something turned out to be a red baseball cap that belonged to a carnival worker, not Susan. The lake gave up fishing lures, beer cans, a waterlogged wallet from the previous summer, but no trace of the missing girl beyond that single sneaker. Morrison interviewed carnival workers as they loaded their trucks, taking notes in his careful handwriting, while the smell of diesel fuel and popcorn oil lingered in the morning air. The ring toss operator remembered Susan checking her watch frequently. The cotton candy vendor had noticed her walking toward the lake around closing time, but no one recalled seeing her with anyone unusual, and everyone agreed she'd seemed distracted but not frightened. Tommy Kowalski became the obvious suspect almost immediately. Young men always drew suspicion when their girlfriends disappeared, and several witnesses remembered seeing them arguing near the ring toss booth earlier in the evening. Morrison brought Tommy in for questioning, watching the boy's hands shake as he lit one Marlboro after another in the stuffy interview room. "She was acting weird all night," Tommy insisted, running his fingers through his hair until it stood up in anxious spikes. "Kept looking at her watch, barely talked to me. I asked her what was wrong, and she said I wouldn't understand." "What wouldn't you understand, Tommy?"
"I don't know, that's what I was trying to figure out. Susan never kept secrets from me. We were talking about getting engaged, for Christ's sake." Morrison filled page after page of his yellow legal pad with notes, the ink sometimes smearing in the humid air. Tommy's alibi for the crucial time period, roughly 10:15 to 11:30 p.m., depended entirely on Margaret Hartley's testimony. She insisted they'd been together, searching for Susan throughout the carnival grounds and along the lakeshore. "Margaret's a good kid," Morrison confided to his partner, Detective Frank Collar, as they reviewed their notes over coffee at Mel's Diner 3 days into the investigation. "But she's protecting her sister's boyfriend. The question is, what's she protecting him from?" The case files grew thicker as days turned to weeks. Morrison interviewed Susan's college friends, her professors, her co-workers at the summer job she'd taken at the local library. Everyone described the same person: bright, responsible, maybe a little serious for her age, certainly not the type to vanish voluntarily or put her family through such agony. Susan's mother, Ellen Hartley, aged visibly during those weeks, her auburn hair showing gray roots she no longer bothered to touch up. She spent her days on the front porch of their small frame house, chain-smoking Marlboros and watching every car that passed, as if Susan might step out of one at any moment with a reasonable explanation for her absence. She was excited about something, Ellen told Morrison during one of his regular check-ins. The past few weeks, she'd get these phone calls and then disappear for hours. Said she was going to the library or shopping with friends, but Margaret said she wasn't at the library and her friends said they hadn't seen her. By October, when the maple trees around Crystal Lake blazed red and gold, the active investigation had essentially stalled. Morrison kept the file on his desk, adding notes whenever new information trickled in, but the leads had dried up like the lake itself during the drought of late summer. The final entry in the original case file, written in Morrison's careful script and dated October 30th, 1973, read simply, "No new developments. Case remains open pending further evidence or witness testimony." Nobody in Crystal Lake talked much about Susan Hartley after the first year. Her disappearance became one of those small-town tragedies that people carried quietly, like a stone in their shoe, always present but rarely acknowledged. Tommy Kowalski left town the following spring, heading to Minneapolis for work and never returning. Morrison retired in 1995, taking the unsolved case with him like unfinished business that would follow him to his grave. But Margaret Hartley never left Crystal Lake, and she never stopped thinking about that August night when her sister walked toward the dark water and vanished forever. By 1993, Margaret Hartley had transformed from the eager teenager who once linked arms with her sister at county fairs into Crystal Lake's head librarian, a position that suited her quiet nature and growing need for solitude. At 39, she lived alone in the family home on Elm Street, keeping Susan's bedroom exactly as it had been 20 years earlier. The rainbow bedspread still stretched tight across the twin mattress, the collection of horse figurines still arranged on the windowsill, the diary still locked in the desk drawer. The house held the accumulated silence of 2 decades, broken only by the familiar sounds of Margaret's carefully structured routine. Each evening after dinner, she would climb the narrow stairs to the second floor and sit in Susan's room, playing records on their father's old turntable, the same Magnavox console stereo that had been the family's prized possession when the girls were young. The needle would find its groove in albums Susan had loved, The Carpenters, Carole King, Jim Croce. The vinyl crackled with the warm static of memory, and Margaret would close her eyes, letting Karen Carpenter's voice transport her back to summer evenings when she and Susan would lie on the floor between the speakers, sharing dreams about their futures while the music washed over them. We've Got Tonight had been Susan's favorite song that final summer, and Margaret played it so often the grooves were wearing thin. She knew every pop and skip by heart, the way the left speaker would fade slightly during the bridge, the tiny scratch that made Karen's voice flutter on the word forever. These imperfections had become precious to her, evidence that Susan had been real, had touched these same objects, had filled this room with her laughter and secrets. The library offered Margaret a refuge from the well-meaning sympathy of neighbors who still spoke of Susan in whispered tones at the grocery store or post office. Among the orderly rows of books, she could lose herself in the methodical work of cataloging and shelving, helping high school students research papers, and maintaining the peace that libraries seem to hold by their very nature. But even there, she couldn't escape the weight of what she carried. The teenagers who came in after school would sometimes cluster near the mystery section, whispering about the Hartley sister who went crazy after Susan disappeared. Margaret would pretend not to hear, but their words followed her home each evening, adding to the accumulating burden of 2 decades worth of silence. The truth was more complex than the local gossips imagined. Margaret hadn't gone crazy, she'd gone somewhere much more difficult to navigate. She lived in a state of suspended reality, where every day brought the possibility that Susan might walk through the front door with a believable explanation for her 20-year absence, but also the growing certainty that such a reunion would never come. She turned down 3 marriage proposals over the years, unable to explain to well-intentioned suitors that her heart was occupied by grief and something much more complicated, a secret that had been eating away at her soul like acid on metal, leaving her hollow and brittle. At night, Margaret would lie in her childhood bed in the room next to Susan's, listening to the sounds of the old house settling around her. The furnace clicking on in winter, the windows creaking in summer storms, the grandfather clock in the hallway marking time with its steady rhythm. These sounds had once been comforting, the audio backdrop of a happy childhood. Now they seemed to whisper accusations, reminding her of the night everything changed. On August 15th of each year, Margaret held a memorial service at the lake. She would place fresh flowers by the dock where Susan's shoe had been found, play a small portable radio tuned to the oldies station, and stand in the place where her sister had last been seen. A handful of longtime residents would join her, Ellen Hartley until her death in 1987, a few family friends, occasionally Detective Morrison before his retirement. But Margaret knew something the others didn't. She knew that Susan's body wasn't in Crystal Lake, despite the extensive searches that had dragged the bottom and explored every inlet and hidden cove. She knew because she'd seen Susan leave the water that night, seen her sister walk away from the lake under her own power. The knowledge sat in her chest like a physical weight, making it hard to breathe during quiet moments when her defenses were down. She'd written letters to the police a dozen times over the years, started phone calls to Detective Morrison that she'd ended before dialing the last digit. The words were there waiting to be spoken, but releasing them would mean dismantling the careful structure of lies and silence that had held her life together for 20 years. Instead, she maintained Susan's memory like a shrine keeper, preserving every photograph, every piece of clothing, every reminder of the sister who had been her closest friend and greatest confidence. The irony wasn't lost on her that in trying to protect Susan's reputation, she'd created a prison for herself, one built from good intentions and terrible choices that had calcified into an unbreakable routine of regret. Margaret Hartley was 44 years old when she finally decided to write down the truth, even if she never planned to share it with another living soul. The confession letter took Margaret 3 weeks to write, filling 17 pages of cream-colored stationery with her careful librarian's handwriting. She'd purchased the paper specially for the occasion, choosing something substantial that felt worthy of the words she'd carried for 25 years. Each evening after the library closed, she would sit at Susan's desk in the preserved bedroom, fountain pen in hand, searching for language adequate to describe the indescribable. "To whom it may concern," she began, then crossed it out. "Dear Detective Morrison," she tried next, but that felt too personal for what she needed to confess. Finally, she settled on simply dating the letter March 15, 1998, and beginning with the words that had echoed in her mind for a quarter century, "I know what happened to Susan." The writing came in bursts, sometimes flowing for pages as memories spilled onto paper, other times stalling for days as Margaret struggled with how to explain the complexity of her motivations. The scent of Susan's old perfume seemed to hang in the air while she wrote, white shoulders with its delicate blend of aldehydes and flowers, still faintly present in the clothes hanging in the closet. She described the weeks leading up to that August night, when Susan had begun receiving mysterious phone calls that would send her hurrying out of the house with explanations that never quite made sense. Library visits that the other librarians didn't remember, shopping trips with friends who later claimed they hadn't seen Susan in weeks. "I followed her twice," Margaret wrote, her pen trembling slightly as she formed the words. "The first time she went to Miller's Point and sat in her car for an hour just waiting. I hid behind the trees, feeling foolish and guilty, but I had to know. She was my sister and she was lying to me about something. The second time was 3 days before the carnival." That second surveillance had revealed Susan's secret. Margaret described watching from behind the maintenance shed at the high school as Susan met Harold Brennan, their former English teacher, in the empty parking lot. Even from a distance, even in the fading daylight, Margaret could see the intimacy in their body language, the way Susan touched his arm, how he leaned close to whisper something that made her laugh. "I couldn't believe it," the letter continued. Harold Brennan was married, had 2 young children. Susan had been his student just 4 years earlier. "I wanted to confront her immediately, but I was too shocked, too confused. I drove home and pretended nothing had happened, hoping I'd misunderstood what I'd seen." Margaret's handwriting grew more erratic as she described the night of the carnival itself, reliving each detail with painful precision. Susan's distracted behavior, the frequent glances at her watch, the way she'd excused herself around 10 o'clock claiming she needed the restroom. Margaret had waited exactly 5 minutes before following, driven by a combination of curiosity and growing dread. "I saw her walking toward the lake, moving quickly like she was late for something important. I stayed back, hiding behind the carnival booths and then the trees along the shoreline. She went straight to the old dock where we used to fish with Dad when we were little." The confession detailed how Margaret had crept closer, positioning herself behind the boathouse where she could see the dock clearly in the moonlight. Harold Brennan was already there, pacing nervously, checking his own watch. When Susan appeared, they embraced briefly before beginning what appeared to be an intense conversation. "I couldn't hear everything they were saying, but their voices kept getting louder. Susan seemed upset about something, gesturing with her hands the way she did when she was trying to make a point. Harold looked angry or maybe scared. It was hard to tell in the darkness." Margaret's pen had pressed so hard into the paper at this point that the ink had bled through to the pages beneath. She described the moment when the conversation escalated into an argument, Susan's voice rising enough that Margaret caught fragments. "Told my mother, and can't keep pretending, and not fair to anyone." Harold grabbed her arms then, shaking her slightly. Susan tried to pull away, and that's when it happened. I don't think he meant to hurt her, but she stumbled backward toward the edge of the dock. Her heel caught on one of the loose boards. Dad always said the town should fix those boards, and she fell. The letter's handwriting became almost illegible as Margaret described watching her sister hit her head on the dock's edge before splashing into the dark water. Harold had immediately jumped in after her, and for a moment Margaret thought he was trying to save Susan. But then she realized he was holding her underwater, panic evident in his movements, Susan's struggles growing weaker until they stopped entirely. "I should have screamed, I should have run to help her, I should have done something, anything, but I just stood there frozen, watching my sister die." By the time I could move again, Harold was dragging her body toward his car, which was parked on the old logging road that runs along the back of the property. I ran home and pretended I'd been there all evening. The final pages of the confession explained Margaret's false alibi for Tommy Kowalski, how she claimed they were together searching for Susan when he was actually questioning other carnival goers alone. She'd lied to protect him from suspicion, she wrote, but also to protect herself from having to explain why she'd been at the lake, what she'd witnessed, and why she'd done nothing to save her sister. "I've lived with this knowledge for 25 years, and it has poisoned everything good in my life. I never married because how could I promise to love someone when I let my own sister die? I never had children because what kind of mother would I be? I stayed in Crystal Lake because leaving felt like abandoning Susan all over again, but staying means living every day with the memory of my cowardice." Margaret sealed the letter in Susan's jewelry box, beneath the tangle of necklaces and earrings that still smelled faintly of White Shoulder's perfume. She told herself she was preserving it for someday, when she found the courage to mail it to Detective Morrison or deliver it to the current police chief. But deep down, she knew the letter would remain hidden, another secret locked away with all the others that had accumulated in the house on Elm Street. The confession brought her no peace, only the hollow satisfaction of having finally put the truth into words, even if those words would never be read by anyone who could act upon them. Detective Sarah Chen had been with the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension for 8 years, when she first encountered the Susan Hartley case file in the summer of 2019. The manila folder, thick with decades of accumulated reports and photographs, had been flagged as part of a statewide initiative to revisit unsolved cases using advances in forensic technology that weren't available during the original investigations.
Chen specialized in cold cases involving genetic evidence, having completed advanced training in forensic genealogy, a revolutionary technique that had emerged in the 2010s and was transforming criminal investigations across the country. The science was elegantly simple in concept. Investigators could take DNA samples from crime scenes and compare them against vast databases of genetic profiles submitted by people researching their family histories. These comparisons could reveal familial relationships that pointed toward potential suspects, even when the perpetrators themselves had never provided DNA samples. The technology had already solved dozens of high-profile cases, including the Golden State Killer investigation that had captured national attention. But Chen was particularly interested in smaller local cases where families had been waiting decades for answers, where hope had been reduced to an ember that needed only the right evidence to flare back to life. Susan Hartley's file contained exactly the kind of biological evidence that made forensic genealogy possible. During the original investigation in 1973, Detective Ray Morrison had preserved several items found at the scene, the white sneaker, of course, but also scrapings taken from under Susan's fingernails when her body was eventually recovered from Crystal Lake 3 weeks after her disappearance. Chen spread the evidence photos across her desk in the BCA's St. Paul headquarters, comparing them with the detailed reports Morrison had filed. The original investigation had been thorough by 1970s standards, but DNA analysis hadn't been invented until 1984, more than a decade after Susan's death. The genetic material collected at the scene had been stored properly, but never tested, waiting nearly 50 years for technology to catch up to its potential. What do we know about the family dynamics? Chen asked her partner, Detective Mike Rodriguez, as they reviewed the witness statements and interview transcripts. Typical small-town stuff on the surface, Rodriguez replied, flipping through his copy of the file. Close-knit family. Susan was the responsible older sister. Margaret was the quiet one who worshipped her. Parents died in the 80s and 90s. Margaret never married, still lives in the family home, works at the library. What about the boyfriend, Tommy Kowalski? Moved to Minneapolis right after the investigation, worked construction for 30 years, retired now. Clean record, no history of violence. His alibi was solid. Margaret Hartley swore they were together searching for Susan the entire time she was missing. Chen made notes on her laptop, the modern technology contrasting sharply with Morrison's handwritten reports. The generational gap in investigative tools was striking. Where Morrison had relied on witness interviews, physical searches, and basic forensic techniques like fingerprinting, Chen had access to databases containing millions of genetic profiles, sophisticated computer modeling, and laboratory techniques that could extract usable DNA from evidence decades old. The first breakthrough came when the lab successfully extracted a partial DNA profile from the material under Susan's fingernails. The sample was degraded after nearly 50 years, but advances in low-template DNA analysis made it possible to develop a usable genetic signature. Chen uploaded the profile to GED Match, Family Tree DNA, and several other genealogy databases, searching for potential familial matches. The results appeared within hours, a 67% probability of shared ancestry with Harold J. Brennan, age 78, currently residing at Sunset Manor Nursing Home in nearby Brainerd, Minnesota. Chen stared at the name on her screen, cross-referencing it with the original case files. Harold Brennan wasn't mentioned anywhere in Morrison's reports, but a quick background check revealed he'd taught English at Crystal Lake High School from 1968 to 1984. Susan would have been his student during her senior year in 1969. Mike, Chen called across the office. We need to take a drive to Brainerd. The forensic genealogy had provided what traditional investigative techniques couldn't, a direct genetic link between Susan Hartley and someone who had been in her life, someone the original investigation had never considered as a suspect. But Chen knew that genetic evidence was only the beginning. Now came the delicate work of building a case that would hold up in court, assuming Harold Brennan was still competent enough to understand the charges against him. The drive to Sunset Manor took them through the same small-town Minnesota landscape where Susan Hartley had grown up and disappeared. Chen found herself imagining the young woman driving these same roads in 1973, perhaps heading to secret meetings with her former teacher, carrying on an affair that would ultimately cost her life. It was a story as old as human nature itself, the forbidden relationship, the older man in a position of authority, the young woman caught between passion and moral obligation. But forensic genealogy had made it possible to finally connect the genetic dots, to transform decades-old suspicions into actionable evidence. The technology that would solve Susan Hartley's murder had been inconceivable when she died, existing only in the realm of science fiction. Now it was routine enough that Chen could process the results on her laptop while driving through the Minnesota countryside, watching the same lakes and forests that had kept their secrets for nearly half a century. Sunset Manor smelled of disinfectant and cafeteria food, with undertones of medicine and the peculiar staleness that seemed to permeate all institutional buildings. Detective Chen signed in at the reception desk, showing her badge to the young nurse who explained that Harold Brennan was in the intermediate care wing, his dementia progressing steadily, but leaving him lucid during certain times of the day. He's usually most coherent in the mornings, the nurse explained, leading Chen down a hallway lined with handrails and motivational posters featuring kittens and sunsets. Some days he thinks he's still teaching, grading papers, and worried about lesson plans. Other days he doesn't recognize his own son. Harold Brennan sat in a wheelchair by the window of the communal sitting area, wearing a cardigan that had been expensive once, but now showed the wear of institutional laundering. At 78, he retained traces of the handsomeness that might have attracted a young student 50 years earlier: strong jawline, intelligent eyes, silver hair still thick enough to comb. But age and illness had carved deep lines around his mouth and given his skin the translucent quality of old paper. Chen introduced herself carefully, settling into the chair across from Harold and speaking in the gentle tone she'd learned to use with elderly witnesses. She decided against mentioning Susan's name immediately, instead asking general questions about his teaching career, letting Harold's own memories guide the conversation. 36 years at Crystal Lake High, Harold said, his voice carrying the measured cadence of someone accustomed to public speaking. English literature, mostly, some creative writing classes when the budget allowed, good kids for the most part. Small towns produce good kids. Do you remember any particular students who stood out? Chen asked, pulling out a small notebook to make him feel like this was a routine interview about education rather than a murder investigation. Harold's eyes grew distant, and for a moment Chen wondered if he was slipping into one of his confused periods. But then he smiled slightly, and she realized he was simply sifting through decades of memories. Oh, there were several bright kids who went on to college, some who became teachers themselves. There was one girl. What was her name? Susan something. Susan Hartley, that was it. Tragic what happened to her. Chen kept her expression neutral, making notes while Harold continued speaking. Brilliant writer, that girl. Had a gift for poetry, understanding the deeper meanings in literature. She stayed after class sometimes to discuss the assignments, asked questions that showed real intellectual curiosity. When was this, Mr. Brennan? Senior year would have been, 1969, maybe 1970, hard to remember exactly, but she was special, you could tell, the kind of student who makes teaching worthwhile. Harold's voice took on the warm tone of an educator, remembering a prize pupil, but Chen noticed something else underneath, a tension that suggested these memories carried complicated emotions. Did you keep in touch with Susan after graduation? Chen asked, watching Harold's face carefully. For just a moment, something flickered in Harold's eyes, surprise, fear, or recognition. But then the dementia seemed to claim him again, and he looked confused, as if he'd forgotten what they were discussing. Susan, I'm sorry, what about Susan? Chen tried a different approach. Mr. Brennan, I'm investigating what happened to Susan Hartley in 1973. She disappeared from a carnival in Crystal Lake. Oh yes, terrible thing. The whole town was shaken up about it. Such a lovely girl and so young. Never did find out what happened, did they? We're hoping to change that. Mr. Brennan, is it possible you saw Susan after she graduated? Maybe she came to visit you, ask for a recommendation letter, anything like that. Harold was quiet for a long time, staring out the window at the nursing home's garden, where a few residents sat in wheelchairs enjoying the afternoon sun. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. She came to see me sometimes, after graduation, said she needed someone to talk to, someone who understood her. Her family was simple people, good people, but they didn't appreciate her intelligence, her potential. Chen leaned forward slightly, careful not to appear too eager. How often did she visit? Once or twice a month, maybe. We would discuss books, poetry, her plans for the future. She was working at the library that summer, saving money for graduate school. She wanted to study literature, maybe become a professor herself. Mr. Brennan, did your relationship with Susan ever become more than teacher and former student? Harold's hands began to tremble slightly, and he gripped the arms of his wheelchair. For a moment, Chen thought he might not answer, might retreat into the fog of dementia that offered escape from difficult questions. I was married, he said finally. I had 2 young children. Barbara and I, we'd been having problems, but I never meant for. Susan was so intelligent, so mature for her age. She understood things my wife couldn't, appreciated literature and ideas in ways that, I know how it sounds, I know what people would think. What happened the night Susan disappeared, Mr. Brennan? I'm not sure I should be talking about this. Is this official? Am I in some kind of trouble? Chen realized that Harold's lucidity was creating a problem. He was aware enough to understand the implications of what he might say, but confused enough that he seemed to view the conversation as hypothetical rather than a real confession to an active police investigation. Mr. Brennan, Susan's body was found 3 weeks after she disappeared. There was evidence of a struggle. Can you help us understand what might have happened to her? Harold closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, tears had begun to form. She wanted me to leave Barbara, said we could go away together, start over somewhere nobody knew us, but I couldn't do that to my children, couldn't destroy my family for what we had. So you met her that night, at the carnival. By the lake, she said she was going to tell everyone about us if I didn't make a choice. Said she couldn't keep pretending we were just friends when she knew we could have more together. I tried to explain that it wasn't that simple, that there were consequences she didn't understand. Harold's voice broke and he covered his face with his hands. She got so angry, started saying things about Barbara, about my children, called them obstacles to our happiness. That's when I don't remember exactly what happened next. There was an argument and somehow she fell. Her head hit the dock and then she was in the water and You what, Mr. Brennan? I panicked. She wasn't moving, wasn't breathing. I thought if I could make it look like an accident, like she'd fallen in by herself. I held her under until I was sure, then I carried her to my car, drove to the quarry on the other side of town and, God forgive me, I weighted her down and dropped her in the deep part. The confession spilled out in fragments, interrupted by Harold's tears and moments when his dementia seemed to pull him away from the present. But the essential details were clear. The affair, the meeting by the lake, Susan's ultimatum, the struggle that ended with her death, and Harold's decision to hide the body rather than report the accident. Chen continued taking notes, knowing that this confession from a man with dementia would never hold up in court, but finally understanding the truth that had eluded investigators for nearly 50 years. The genetic evidence had led them to the right person, but it was Harold's own guilt, preserved despite his failing memory, that provided the final pieces of the puzzle. As she prepared to leave, Harold grabbed her arm with surprising strength. You'll tell her family I'm sorry. Tell them I never meant for any of this to happen. She was the brightest light I ever knew, and I destroyed her. I've been living with that for 50 years, and it's eaten away everything good in my life. Chen patted his hand gently and promised she would deliver his message, knowing that justice for Susan Hartley would have to come in forms other than a criminal trial. Harold Brennan was dying by degrees in a nursing home, his mind fragmenting a little more each day, carrying the weight of his crime toward whatever judgment awaited him. Margaret Hartley was cataloging return books in the library's back room when Detective Chen arrived on a humid Thursday afternoon in August 2019, almost exactly 46 years after Susan's disappearance. The timing wasn't coincidental. Chen had chosen the anniversary date deliberately, hoping that the emotional significance might help Margaret process the information she was about to receive. Ms. Hartley, I'm Detective Chen with the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension. I'd like to speak with you about your sister Susan's case, if you have a few minutes. Margaret looked up from her card of books, and Chen immediately understood why people in town still whispered about the sad sister who'd never recovered from her loss. At 65, Margaret carried herself with the careful posture of someone who'd learned to make herself small, to take up minimal space in a world that felt too large and unpredictable. Her gray hair was pulled back in a practical bun, and she wore the kind of modest dress that suggested someone who'd stopped caring about fashion decades ago. Has something happened? Have you found something new? Chen had delivered this kind of news before, but it never became routine. Each family carried their grief differently, and she'd learned to watch for signs of how much information the survivors could handle at once. We've identified the person responsible for Susan's death. I wanted to tell you in person before it becomes public knowledge. Margaret's hands went to her throat, fingers touching the space where a necklace might rest, a gesture that reminded Chen of the nervous habits described in the original witness statements about Susan. Who was it? Was it Tommy? Everyone always suspected Tommy, but I told them he was with me. I gave him an alibi because I knew he didn't do it. Chen watched Margaret's face carefully, noting the way her voice caught on the word alibi and how her eyes darted toward the library's front windows, as if checking to make sure they weren't being overheard. No, Ms. Hartley, it wasn't Tommy. The DNA evidence led us to Harold Brennan. He was Susan's English teacher at the high school. He confessed to killing her during an argument by the lake that night. Margaret went very still, so motionless that Chen wondered if she'd heard correctly. Then, slowly, Margaret sank into the chair behind the circulation desk, her face draining of color. "Harold Brennan," Margaret whispered, and Chen realized this wasn't the first time Margaret had heard that name in connection with her sister. "Ms. Hartley, did you know about Susan's relationship with Mr. Brennan?" The question hung in the air between them while Margaret stared at her hands, fingers now twisted together in her lap. When she finally looked up, her eyes held the hollow look of someone who'd been carrying an unbearable weight for too long. "I saw them together 3 days before the carnival. I followed Susan because she'd been acting so secretively, and I watched them meet in the high school parking lot. I couldn't believe it at first. Harold was married, had children, and Susan was only 22, but the way they looked at each other, I knew it wasn't innocent." Chen pulled out her notebook, sensing that Margaret was finally ready to share information she'd kept hidden for decades. "Did you confront Susan about what you saw?" "I should have. I wanted to, but I was afraid of what she might say, afraid of destroying our relationship over something I hoped wasn't serious. Susan was always the strong one, the one who knew what she wanted. I convinced myself that she would end it on her own, that she wouldn't really risk everything for a married man." Margaret's voice grew stronger as she continued, as if the relief of finally speaking the truth was giving her energy she hadn't felt in years. "That night at the carnival, when Susan kept checking her watch and acting distracted, I knew she was planning to meet him. After she left to use the restroom and didn't come back, I waited exactly 5 minutes and then followed her. I told everyone later that Tommy and I were together searching for her, but that wasn't true. I was alone, and I saw what happened at the lake." Chen leaned forward, hardly believing what she was hearing. "You witnessed Susan's murder." "I was hiding behind the boathouse. I could see them talking on the dock, and their voices kept getting louder. Susan was gesturing with her hands, the way she always did when she was trying to make a point. Harold looked angry or scared. It was hard to tell in the moonlight." Margaret described the argument in detail, her memory surprisingly clear after nearly 5 decades. She'd heard fragments of Susan's words, threats to tell Harold's wife about their affair unless he chose between his family and their relationship. She'd watched Harold grab Susan's arms, seen her sister stumble backward, and hit her head on the dock's edge. "I thought it was an accident at first. Harold jumped into the water right after her, and I thought he was trying to save her. But then I realized he was holding her under, and Susan stopped struggling, and I knew she was dead." "Why didn't you call for help? Why didn't you report what you saw?" Margaret's composure finally cracked, tears streaming down her cheeks as she tried to explain the paralysis that had gripped her 46 years ago. "I was terrified, frozen. By the time I could move again, Harold was dragging Susan's body toward his car. I ran home and pretended I'd been there all evening. When the police started questioning Tommy, I lied and said we'd been together because I couldn't bear to see him blamed for something he didn't do, but I also couldn't bring myself to tell the truth about what I'd really seen." Chen understood now why the original investigation had stalled. Margaret's false alibi had protected Tommy from serious suspicion, but it had also eliminated the one witness who could have solved the case immediately. "Ms. Hartley, I need you to understand that withholding this information was obstruction of justice. You could have been charged as an accessory after the fact. I know I've known that for 46 years. I've written confession letters, started phone calls to the police, planned to tell the truth 1,000 times. But I was afraid of going to prison, afraid of what people would think, afraid of admitting that I let my sister die because I was too much of a coward to act." Margaret reached into her purse and pulled out an old jewelry box, the kind with a tiny ballerina that spun when the lid opened. From beneath the tangle of costume jewelry, she withdrew a thick envelope sealed with tape that had yellowed with age. "I wrote this in 1998. It's everything I saw that night, everything I should have told Detective Morrison 25 years earlier. I've carried it with me every day since then, thinking that maybe today would be the day I finally found the courage to mail it." Chen accepted the envelope, feeling its weight and recognizing the significance of what Margaret was entrusting to her. This letter represented decades of guilt and self-punishment, a burden that had shaped every aspect of Margaret's adult life. "Harold Brennan is dying in a nursing home," Chen said gently. "His dementia is advanced, and he'll never stand trial for Susan's murder. But your testimony can still provide closure for your family, for the community that's wondered about Susan for all these years." "Will I be arrested?" "That's not my decision to make. but I can tell you that prosecutors rarely pursue charges in cases this old, especially when the witness is cooperating fully and the primary perpetrator is deceased or incompetent to stand trial. Margaret nodded, wiping her eyes with a tissue from the box she kept on the circulation desk. Around them, the library's afternoon quiet was broken only by the sound of the old radiator and the distant hum of the air conditioning system that struggled against the August heat. "I need to ask you something else, Ms. Hartley. Harold told us he weighted Susan's body and put it in the quarry, but Susan's body was found in Crystal Lake 3 weeks later. Can you explain that?" Margaret was quiet for a long moment, and Chen sensed there was still more to the story. "Harold was panicking that night. He wasn't thinking clearly. I watched him put Susan in his car, but I don't think he drove to the quarry. I think he drove around for hours, not knowing what to do, and eventually brought her back to the lake. Maybe he thought if her body was found there, it would look like she'd fallen in accidentally during the carnival." It made sense, Chen realized. The crime scene evidence had always suggested that Susan had entered the water near the dock, not that her body had drifted there from another location. Harold's confession about the quarry was either a false memory created by his dementia or a deliberate misdirection meant to throw off the investigation. "Ms. Hartley, I know this has been incredibly difficult for you, but I want you to know that coming forward now, even after all these years, takes tremendous courage. Your sister's case can finally be closed because you decided to tell the truth." Margaret looked around the library that had been her refuge for decades, taking in the familiar rows of books and the afternoon sunlight streaming through the tall windows. For the first time in 46 years, she felt the possibility of a future not defined entirely by her past. "I've wasted so much of my life carrying this secret. I never married, never had children, never left Crystal Lake because I felt like I didn't deserve happiness after what I'd done, or rather, after what I'd failed to do." "You were 19 years old and traumatized by watching your sister die. The choices you made afterward weren't rational, but they were understandable." Chen gathered her notes and prepared to leave, knowing that Margaret would need time to process everything that had happened. The case that had defined both of their lives, Margaret's through her silence, Chen's through her investigation, was finally reaching resolution. "Detective Chen," Margaret called as she reached the library door, "will you tell me what happens next? With the case, I mean, with Harold." "Harold Brennan will die in that nursing home, probably within the next year or two. His family knows now that he killed Susan, and they'll have to live with that knowledge. The case will be officially closed, and there will probably be media attention for a few weeks. But then Crystal Lake will go back to being a quiet town, and you can decide how you want to spend whatever years you have left." Chen paused at the door, looking back at Margaret, who sat surrounded by the books that had been her constant companions through decades of isolation. "Ms. Hartley, you've spent 46 years punishing yourself for failing to save your sister. But Susan made her own choices too. She chose to have an affair with a married man. She chose to pressure him to leave his family. She chose to meet him by that lake. You're not responsible for the consequences of her decisions, even if you witnessed them." After Chen left, Margaret sat alone in the empty library, listening to the familiar sounds that had provided comfort during the darkest periods of her life. The case was solved. The truth was finally known, but she wasn't sure yet what that meant for her future. She opened Susan's jewelry box and looked at the empty space where the confession letter had rested for 21 years. For the first time since 1973, the box held only jewelry, tangled necklaces and earrings that still carried the faint scent of White Shoulders perfume, but no longer held the weight of unspoken secrets. Margaret Hartley was 65 years old, and for the first time in her adult life, she was free to decide who she wanted to become. The news of Harold Brennan's confession and the resolution of Susan Hartley's 46-year-old murder case made headlines across Minnesota for 3 weeks in September 2019. The Minneapolis Star-Tribune ran a front-page story about forensic genealogy solving cold cases, while local television stations interviewed residents of Crystal Lake who remembered the summer when a young woman vanished from the carnival and was never seen alive again. Margaret found herself thrust into an unwelcome spotlight, fielding calls from reporters who wanted to interview the sister who never gave up hope, and true crime podcasters eager to explore the psychological aspects of a family torn apart by unsolved murder. She declined most interviews, issuing a brief statement through the police department thanking Detective Chen and expressing relief that the truth had finally emerged. Harold Brennan died in his sleep at Sunset Manor on October 12, 2019, taking with him any possibility of a criminal trial, but leaving behind a family devastated by the revelation of his decades-old crime. His son Michael, who had visited faithfully every week for 3 years, stopped coming to Crystal Lake entirely. His daughter Patricia moved to Arizona and changed her last name, unable to bear the association with her father's actions. The nursing home staff reported that Harold's final weeks were marked by increasing agitation and moments of clarity, where he would ask repeatedly about the girl by the lake and whether someone had told her family he was sorry. He died holding a photograph of his wife Barbara, who had passed away in 2003, never knowing that her marriage had been built on a foundation of lies and murder. For Margaret, the resolution brought a complex mixture of relief and grief she hadn't anticipated. The weight of her secret was gone, but it had been replaced by a different kind of sorrow, mourning for all the years she'd lost to guilt and isolation, all the experiences she'd denied herself because she believed she didn't deserve happiness. Detective Chen visited Margaret one final time in November, bringing the official closure documents and an update on how the case was being recorded in the state's criminal database. They met at the library after hours, sitting at the same table where Margaret had spent countless evenings reading alone. "How are you adjusting?" Chen asked, noting that Margaret looked different somehow, not younger exactly, but less burdened, as if she'd been carrying a heavy weight that had finally been lifted from her shoulders. "It's strange," Margaret admitted. "I spent so many years thinking about what I would do if the truth ever came out. I imagined being arrested, going to trial, having everyone in town know what I'd done. But none of that happened. Harold died, the case is closed, and life just continues." "What will you do now?" Margaret had been asking herself the same question for months. At 65, she was eligible for retirement from the library, but she'd never made plans beyond maintaining Susan's memory and managing the guilt that had defined her adult life. "I'm thinking about selling the house. It's too big for one person, and there are too many memories there. Maybe I'll move somewhere warmer, somewhere I can start over without everyone knowing my story." Chen understood the impulse, but she also recognized something in Margaret's voice that suggested uncertainty about leaving the only home she'd ever known. "You don't have to run away from Crystal Lake, Ms. Hartley. You've lived here your entire life, and this community is part of who you are. The people here have watched you carry your grief with dignity for 46 years. That counts for something." Margaret considered this, thinking about the library patrons who'd become familiar faces over the decades, the neighbors who still brought her casseroles during the harsh Minnesota winters, the teenagers who'd sought her help with research projects and college applications. "Maybe you're right. Maybe I've spent so much time hiding from people that I forgot some of them actually care about me." They talked for another hour about the case, about Margaret's plans for the future, and about the strange process of learning to live without the secret that had shaped her entire adult life. When Chen finally prepared to leave, Margaret walked her to the library's front door, something she hadn't done with a visitor in years. "Detective Chen, can I ask you something? Do you think Susan would have forgiven me for not trying to save her, for keeping quiet all these years?" Chen had been expecting this question, recognizing it as the core wound that had never healed despite the case's resolution. "Ms. Hartley, from everything I learned about Susan during this investigation, she was someone who made her own choices and lived with the consequences. She chose to have that affair, chose to pressure Harold to leave his family, chose to meet him by the lake that night. You were 19 years old, watching something traumatic happen to someone you loved. You reacted the way most people would react, with shock, fear, and confusion." Chen paused, choosing her words carefully. "I think Susan would understand that you were trying to protect everyone, Tommy from suspicion, Harold's family from scandal, your own family from more pain. Those weren't selfish motivations, even if the result caused you decades of suffering." After Chen left, Margaret locked up the library and walked home through the quiet streets of Crystal Lake. The October air carried the scent of burning leaves and the first hint of winter familiar smells that had marked the passage of seasons throughout her life. Instead of going directly home, she found herself walking toward the lake, following the same path Susan had taken that August night in 1973. The old dock had been replaced years ago with a modern structure that included safety railings and better lighting, but the water itself remained unchanged, dark, mysterious, holding its secrets until technology and persistence finally forced them to the surface. Margaret stood where her sister had died, looking out over the water that reflected the streetlights like scattered stars. For the first time in 46 years, she felt ready to say goodbye. "I'm sorry, Susan," she whispered to the quiet water. "I'm sorry I couldn't save you, and I'm sorry it took so long to tell the truth. But it's over now, and I'm going to try to live the rest of my life in a way that would make you proud." The lake offered no response except the gentle lapping of waves against the new dock, but Margaret felt a sense of peace that had eluded her for nearly half a century. She turned away from the water and walked home, ready to begin the process of building a life defined by hope rather than guilt, by the future rather than the past. At 78, Margaret Hartley enrolled in a community college creative writing class, something she'd wanted to do since her 20s, but had never felt she deserved. Her first assignment was to write about a significant moment in her life, and for the first time, she wrote about Susan, not about the night she died, but about the summers when they were children, lying on the living room floor listening to records and dreaming about their futures. The story began, "My sister Susan taught me that music could transport you anywhere, even from a small town in Minnesota to places you'd only imagined. We would close our eyes and let the Carpenters carry us away, two girls who believed the world was full of endless possibilities." It was the first story Margaret had written that ended with hope instead of regret, and she knew Susan would have been proud. 3 years after Harold Brennan's death, Margaret Hartley stood in the familiar sanctuary of Crystal Lake's small United Methodist Church, addressing a crowd larger than any she'd spoken to in her 70 years. The occasion was the dedication of a new scholarship fund established in Susan's memory, funded by the sale of the family home on Elm Street and Margaret's decision to donate her life savings to help young women pursue higher education. The morning light streamed through stained glass windows that had watched over the community's joys and sorrows for more than a century, casting colored patterns across faces both familiar and new. Margaret recognized most of the older residents, people who'd lived through Susan's disappearance and the decades of questions that followed. But there were younger faces too, including several of her former creative writing students who'd insisted on attending to support their unexpected mentor. "When my sister Susan disappeared in 1973, our family thought we'd lost everything," Margaret began, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was sharing. "What we actually lost was our innocence, our belief that terrible things only happen to other people in other places. But what we found, eventually, was that truth has a way of surfacing even when we think it's buried too deep to recover." She spoke about Susan's dreams of becoming a literature professor, her love of poetry and learning, her belief that education could transform lives and open doors that seemed permanently closed. Margaret didn't mention the affair or the circumstances of Susan's death. Those details belonged to the past, to the court records and newspaper articles that would preserve the factual narrative of the case. Instead, she focused on the Susan she wanted people to remember, the older sister who'd helped her with homework, who'd shared books and dreams, and the kind of late-night conversations that happen between siblings who believe they'll have forever to continue them. The Susan Hartley Memorial Scholarship will support young women from small towns who dream of pursuing literature, education, or library science, fields that Susan loved and that have shaped my own life in ways I'm still discovering. We can't change what happened to Susan, but we can honor her memory by helping others achieve the dreams she never had the chance to fulfill. After the ceremony, Margaret found herself surrounded by well-wishers and former students, people who'd watched her transformation from the town's sad sister into someone who'd found purpose in service to others. The conversation flowed easily now, no longer weighed down by the secrets she'd carried for so long. Detective Chen had driven up from St. Paul for the dedication, bringing with her a framed photograph of Susan from the case file, a high school portrait that showed the young woman's bright smile and intelligent eyes, captured before tragedy derailed her future. "She would have been proud of what you've built from this tragedy," Chen told Margaret as they stood together outside the church, watching families load into cars for Sunday lunch gatherings. "I hope so," Margaret replied. "I spent so many years thinking I didn't deserve happiness because I'd failed to save her. It took me until I was nearly 70 to understand that the best way to honor Susan's memory wasn't through guilt and isolation, but through living fully and helping others do the same." Margaret had indeed sold the family home, but instead of leaving Crystal Lake as she'd once planned, she'd moved into a small apartment above the bookstore on Main Street. The change allowed her to be more connected to the community, while leaving behind the rooms filled with preserved memories that had become more prison than shrine. Her creative writing classes had evolved into a weekly group for older adults who were discovering or rediscovering their voices through storytelling. They met at the library, where Margaret had worked for decades, sharing coffee and memories while encouraging each other to transform life experiences into written narrative. "The thing about secrets," Margaret often told her writing students, "is that they grow heavier the longer you carry them. But truth, even painful truth, has a lightness to it that can set you free if you're brave enough to speak it." The lesson had emerged from her own journey, but it resonated with others who'd lived long enough to accumulate their own burdens of unspoken regrets and missed opportunities. Her writing group had become something of a local phenomenon, with participants ranging from retired farmers to former teachers, all united by the desire to make sense of their lives through the act of putting words on paper. Margaret's own writing had flourished in ways that surprised her. The story about listening to music with Susan had been followed by others, memories of their father teaching them to fish, their mother's Sunday dinners that brought neighbors together, the small rituals that had defined their childhood before tragedy reshaped everything. She'd even written about that August night in 1973, but not as confession or apology. Instead, she'd crafted it as a meditation on the choices we make in moments of crisis, the ways trauma can freeze us in patterns that take decades to break, and the possibility of redemption even when we believe we're beyond forgiveness. The piece had been published in a literary magazine that focused on stories by older writers, earning Margaret her first byline at age 71. The editor's note had described it as a powerful exploration of guilt, family loyalty, and the courage required to live authentically after surviving tragedy. As the afternoon sun began its descent toward Crystal Lake, Margaret walked the familiar streets of her hometown with a lightness she hadn't felt since before Susan disappeared. The town looked different now, not because it had changed dramatically, but because she was seeing it with eyes no longer clouded by shame and self-imposed exile. At the lake itself, she paused beside the memorial bench that had been installed near the new dock, reading the simple inscription, Susan Marie Hartley, 1950–1973, beloved daughter and sister, her love of learning lives on. Margaret had chosen those words carefully, wanting to capture Susan's essence without reference to the circumstances of her death. The bench faced the water where Susan had spent her final moments, but it also looked toward the town she'd loved, the community that had never forgotten her, even when the truth seemed permanently buried. A young mother pushing a stroller stopped beside the bench, reading the inscription with the casual curiosity of someone new to town. "Was this someone you knew?" she asked Margaret, noting the older woman's contemplative expression. "My sister," Margaret replied simply. "She died young, but she had big dreams. We're trying to make sure those dreams continue through other young women who need a chance." The mother smiled and continued her walk, her toddler waving from the stroller with the unself-conscious joy of childhood. Margaret watched them disappear around the lake's perimeter path, thinking about all the families who'd continue to create memories by this water, children who'd grow up hearing Susan's story as part of the town's history, but not its defining tragedy. The moral lesson that had taken Margaret 70 years to learn crystallized in that moment. We can't undo the past, but we can choose how it shapes our future. The secrets we keep to protect others sometimes end up destroying ourselves, while the truths we're afraid to speak often hold the keys to redemption and growth. Susan's death had been the result of choices: Harold's choice to pursue an inappropriate relationship, Susan's choice to pressure him beyond his breaking point, Margaret's choice to remain silent rather than intervene. But Margaret's life after Susan's death had also been shaped by choices, and she'd finally learned to make ones that honored both her sister's memory and her own remaining years. As evening fell over Crystal Lake, Margaret returned to her apartment above the bookstore, where she kept a small turntable and a collection of vinyl records that included some of Susan's favorites. She put on a Carpenter's album, letting Karen's voice fill the quiet space with the same warmth it had brought to their childhood. But instead of dwelling on what had been lost, Margaret opened her laptop and began working on her next story, a piece about new beginnings, second chances, and the unexpected gifts that can emerge from even the darkest chapters of our lives. The music played softly while she wrote, carrying her back to evenings when she and Susan had dreamed about their futures. This time, though, Margaret was writing her own future, one word at a time, finally free to become the person she'd always had the potential to be. At 73, Margaret Hartley had learned that it's never too late to start living authentically, to transform pain into purpose, and to discover that love, even love complicated by loss and regret, can ultimately guide us toward grace. The case of Susan Hartley was officially closed, but her story continued through scholarship recipients who carried her dreams forward, through Margaret's writing that helped others find their voices, and through the quiet recognition that even small-town tragedies can teach us profound lessons about forgiveness, courage, and the possibility of redemption. Outside her window, Crystal Lake reflected the stars like scattered diamonds, holding its secrets in the darkness, but no longer threatening to drown those who'd learned to swim in the deep waters of truth.